I think I have a problem. Anytime I see a game I think might be interesting enough for a review or a let's play, I'll just automatically add it to my wish list so I won't forget it. Well, just look at this. Almost 250 games on it now, and my GOG wish list isn't exactly short either. I mean, I've only got so much time to devote to making reviews. How am I supposed to pick which one to do? Wait. That's it. What if I don't pick just one? What if I do more than one? I could come up with some kind of theme, pick a few games to review that fit the theme, and knock out that wish list in no time at all. Brilliant! Quick, play the intro for this idea I've only just had and I haven't prepared in any way whatsoever. Konnichiwa mina, ore wa JC Gemini, soste Quick Time Event de yokoso! Each episode in this new little idea of mine consists of a series of mini reviews. Not as detailed as the full thing, but enough to get the point across, on games which fit a certain theme or genre. And on this inaugural episode, we'll be looking at platformers. Here's a list of the games I'll be talking about later on in the episode, complete with time codes in case you just want to skip to one particular game in particular. I said particular twice, but oh well, here they are!
We'll be snapping and manipulating the very world around us in camera Obscura. Then it's on to Kbyte, a game that shows love to just about every 2D console you can think of from the 80s and 90s. Finally, we've got a blast from the past as we take a look at a compilation of games featuring one of the more popular characters of 90s PC gaming in the Commander Keen Complete Pack.
Demo mazu wa kore desu. If you follow news in the gaming world even a little bit, then you've most likely heard about the recent release of a little game called Yooka-Laylee. It was developed and successfully kickstarted by a group called Playtonic, and is a spiritual successor to such classic Nintendo 64 games as Banjo-Kazooie and Donkey Kong 64. No surprise really when you consider much of the staff of Playtonic used to be much of the staff of Rare, the developers of the aforementioned classics.
But as popular as Yooka-Laylee may be, its regular price is $40, and not everyone's going to be able to afford that right off the bat.
So while I was searching for a cheaper alternative that I could possibly review for low-budget gaming, I came across this game, Macbat 64, a game which is not only cheaper as well as being a love letter to old-school collectathons, but is deliberately styled to look like a Nintendo 64 game, despite being released only a couple of months ago at the time of this recording.
Even its system tray icon resembles an N64 cartridge, and when you start the game up, the game's launcher gives you only one graphics option: 64 bits of power. Now the game is far from perfect. The camera has the tendency to get in way too close to Macbat at times. Other than the resolution settings in the launcher, there's basically no options menu, and some of the control prompts are inaccurate. For instance, when starting the game it tells you to press jump without actually telling you what button that is, and during cutscenes, pressing a button will display a message saying to press escape to skip, whether or not you have a controller plugged in.
And one other thing, the game is very short. When I beat it, my playtime clocked in at around an hour and a half. Regular viewers of low-budget gaming will no doubt remember that I have chewed games out in the past for being short. Out There Somewhere was barely 2 hours long, and for a more recent example, although In Existence had 3 game modes, there was little to no difference between each one, meaning you were practically playing the same game with each mode, and again, you'd maybe get 2 or 3 hours out of it. But my problem with short games isn't necessarily the fact that they're short. It's whether or not the content I experienced in that short amount of time was worth it.
Gray Fox, a game I did a Let's Play on, also clocked in at under 2 hours, even factoring in bits where I stopped to make commentary.
But it was one of the most entertaining games I'd ever played, and as I later found out, it even had multiple endings. And I had similar feelings upon completing Macbat 64.
When playing the game, it becomes abundantly clear that Marcus Horn, the developer of Macbat, had a great fondness not just for Banjo, but other genres as well. Though most of the game is a 3D platformer, there are also 1 or 2 2.5D side-scrolling levels, as well as a kart racing level.
Something else I actually didn't know until I wrote this episode was that this wasn't Horn's first 3D collectathon-inspired game either.
Macbat 64 is actually a sequel to another game called Kiwi 64, which is available on GameJolt, and there are characters and references from that game in Macbat.
Each of Macbat's levels can be dealt with in about 5 minutes. but they're still excellently designed with interesting challenges and secrets and surprises for those that know how and where to look.
My personal favorite level has to be this one, Tubular City. I mean, look at it. It's like the 80s just threw up all over this place, and it's just so freaking subarashida.
Last but not least, there's Macbat himself. I mean, look at him. He's a tiny little bat wearing a waistcoat and a monocle. If he takes a swim, he wears a set of goggles over that. And even in the aforementioned Tubular City, he swaps out his gear for a pair of sunglasses and a Marty McFly jacket. If this guy isn't the most adorable video game character you've ever seen, then you, sir, are entitled to your opinions. And I'll respect them. You'll be wrong, but I'll still respect you. So, Macbat 64 may not have been the cheaper ukulele alternative I was looking for, but it is still a game made with love for the genre, oozing with humor and charm, and is definitely worth your time. Here we have an example of a game relying too heavily on one mechanic. Camera Obscura is a very basic platformer in which your character, a photographer, attempts to climb to the top of a tower that once belonged to a religious sect that worshipped the sun.
Other than that little introductory blurb, which I only knew because it was on the game's Steam page, the game has no prologue or introduction of any kind, instead dropping you right into the action when starting a new game.
Which is not to say the game has no story, far from it, but you have to work for it. The game is told in pieces through these photographs, most of which are hidden in out-of-the-way locations.
The photos are a bit of a double-edged sword to me. On the one hand, you'll always get the next bit of the story every time you collect one, but on the other, it's hard to tell if you've missed any, as there's no indication of how many photos any one level has, and the counter in the bottom right corner only tells you how many photos you've collected, rather than which particular one you have.
As far as abilities go, you can move, you can jump, and that's about it. Apart from the game's one unique mechanic. You have the ability to snap an after image of the surrounding platforms, essentially cloning them to make new platforms, which you can then move around for a short time before they're set in place.
Despite the presence of enemies, your character has no defensive capabilities to speak of. You can technically use an after image to crush enemies, but then you can also crush yourself if you're not careful. Aesthetically speaking, the game is a little bit of a mixed bag. The environments are beautifully designed, if a bit sparse. Meanwhile, the enemies in the game are very basic, and while your character is a little more detailed, there's still little to differentiate her from any other run-of-the-mill platformer character other than maybe the camera attached to her belt.
For me, the high point of the game was probably its soundtrack. In fact, if, for whatever reason, you do end up getting the game, take my advice. Plop down the extra buck and get it with the soundtrack. Its music has quickly become one of my favorite game OSTs. With that said, however, I can't really think of anything about this game to make it worth a good recommendation. I mean, the story is only told through the previously mentioned photographs, which eventually stop being worth the effort of finding them. Maybe it would be better if the story were told through actual photographs in the form of images or drawings, which were left to you, the player, to interpret, or if collecting a certain number gave you new abilities. But nope, it's just, hey, congratulations, you went well out of your way to get this, here's some bland-looking text. The after-image mechanic is a neat feature, but it's also the only feature. As a result, Camera Obscura quickly begins doing what no game ever should. After playing it for a while, it makes you start to think, is that it? Even the presence of Steam Workshop doesn't really help, as all you'll find there is more levels, and some of those aren't that well designed. All in all, you could do worse for a couple of bucks, but you could also do much better. A few years ago, I was browsing through Google Play looking for basically anything interesting to play on my phone, when I came across a game called Evoland.
Evoland was an RPG adventure game and a video game history lesson all rolled into one. As the more you played, the more you would gradually unlock things like movement, a health meter, different forms of combat, even better graphics and sound. It was an enjoyable game, and I had fun with it for a little while before eventually putting it down and moving on.
Fast forward to today, well, I suppose more accurately a couple of weeks ago, when I was looking for games to review for this show, and I was intrigued to find what appeared to be the platformer equivalent of Evoland, a game called Kbyte.
In Kbyte, you control the titular Kbyte, a floating bunny-shaped robot, because why not, across dozens of levels spanning multiple worlds.
Each world has its own graphical style, mimicking that of classic gaming consoles, running the gamut from the 16-bit environs of the Sega Genesis and Super Nintendo to the monochrome world of the original Game Boy, with even retro computers like the Commodore 64 represented.
Furthering the homage, 4 levels in each world have a collectible item in the form of a cartridge from whatever console that world represents.
And of course, a retro-styled game wouldn't be complete without its chiptunes, and this game certainly has plenty of them. My usual feelings towards this type of music apply here. There were 1 or 2 songs in the menu jukebox I kinda liked, but for the most part I could take it or leave it. Though I will say, some of the music in the later worlds, or at least a couple of them anyway, did start to get repetitive quickly.
There's a very, very basic story to Kbyte, which is told not all that well, if I'm totally honest, through cutscenes which generally happen before you enter a new world. This big bad boss-type dude wants Kbyte, and sends his incompetent minions to spy on him, and when Kbyte eventually gets to the boss's castle, the boss reveals himself to be a floating Italian-American Yakuza gangster head. I don't know either. Really, the game could have done away with all the cutscenes, and it wouldn't have harmed the overall product one bit.
So let's talk a little more about Kbyte himself. I have to say, I like his design. He's a charming little bot. As mentioned before, he has no legs, it just floats around, and when it comes to controlling him, he does indeed feel a little floaty.
He's also got some momentum to him, as well as a jump that would make Mario blush if you press the button hard enough, and 1 hit is all it takes to kill him.
And that last part in and of itself, I don't mind so much. Makes for a challenging game, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. But when you combine the 1-hit kill with the fact that Kbyte does that annoying thing where even touching the side of a long spike kills him, which I've always hated, plus the fact that Kbyte's hitbox seems to be designed in such a way that a spike's tip doesn't necessarily have to be touching Kbyte to kill him, the game tends to wander away from challenging territory at some points and start to venture into annoying territory.
My spiky grievances aside, however, Kbyte is not a game that's difficult for the sake of being difficult. Every time I messed up, it was always on me, never the game's fault. It pushes you not just to figure out how to get past each obstacle, but to remember it each time you respawn, and believe me, you will respawn plenty of times in this game, and there's no checkpoints to help you out either. There's even what I consider to be the game's hard mode in the form of a second character called Kbyte. When you complete each world, you unlock the ability to play through the world again as Kbyte.
Now it should be noted that when I played through the game, I picked up all the collectibles on my first time through. I didn't have to go back for any. So I don't know if there's some prerequisite for unlocking Kbyte, like collecting all the collectibles, or beating all the levels under a certain time, or if you just have to get to the end of the world. But the reason I consider Kbyte to be the hard mode is that instead of jumping, Kbyte alters gravity to move up or down each time you press the button, making for a more challenging time getting through each level. I didn't play much with Kbyte, I had a hard enough time with Kbyte.
When I'd finished the game, I remember feeling proud of myself for getting through all the levels, and not too bad of a time if I do say so myself.
Last time I checked, I was somewhere around number 15 on the game's leaderboard. Then a couple of days later, a thought struck me. Something occurred to me about Kbyte's graphics which I never stopped to wonder about while I was playing the game. What reason did it have for having different graphical styles for each world? Beyond the obvious homage to classic consoles, there's really no point to them. No reason for the worlds to be styled the way they are.
There's a good reason I brought up Evoland at the beginning of the review. In that game, you took a journey through the evolution of adventure games as you played, thus there was a point to the changing graphic styles. They were as much a part of the game as all the abilities and features you unlocked. Take them away, and Evoland wouldn't be the same game. Even in Macbat 64, the point of the game was to pay tribute not just to video games past in general, but to a specific console in a specific era, so the graphics were again a key part of the game.
With Kbyte, however, I felt the different graphics were, much like the cutscenes, unnecessary. You could limit the game to one retro graphical style, or hell, even make it a 3D game, and it would still be the same game. But I've rambled on long enough. Kbyte is an excellent platformer with just the right amount of challenge and is definitely worth the price tag. Hell, I might even try and speedrun the game myself and improve my spot on the leaderboard. We move on from a game that simply looks old school to a game that actually is old school. This one hits me right in the childhood, it does. Growing up, I played plenty of PC games in my spare time, and from various genres. Shooters like Doom and Rise of the Triad, point and clicks like the King's Quest series, the odd racer or two, and of course, platformers like the original Duke Nukem, Jazz Jackrabbit, and this guy, Commander Keen.
Now, even though what we'll be talking about is labeled the Commander Keen Complete Pack, it only contains the first 5 episodes in the series, all of which were developed by id Software and published by Apogee. The 6th episode, along with another game titled Keen Dreams, were published by different people and aren't included in the pack. Commander Keen is the alter ego of 8-year-old genius Billy Blaze, who, when his parents aren't looking, swipes his brother's football helmet and blasts off into space using a rocket he built out of soup cans and spare parts to dispense galactic justice with an iron hand.
You know, as you do at that age.
In the first trilogy of games, collectively titled Invasion of the Vorticons, Keen lands on Mars, whereupon his rocket is stripped of all its vital components. So Keen must traverse the red planet, avoiding its many denizens and death traps, recover the parts to his ship, and jet back home before his parents are any the wiser. He does this only to find a Vorticon spaceship hovering above Earth and preparing to destroy the planet. So, having fooled his parents into thinking he's asleep, Keen quickly sets off again, boards the Vorticon ship, and disables its Tantalus ray guns, each one pointed at a different capital city, though if Episode 2's Game Over screen is anything to go by, they really only need one. Keen learns that the Vorticons come from the planet Vorticon 6, and are being controlled by a being known as the Great Intellect. So in the 3rd episode, he blasts off to the Vorticons' home planet to put a stop to the threat once and for all.
Now, I don't want to spoil the story any more than necessary, so I won't reveal any more details here, but I will say, I was surprised that the story was more in-depth than I remembered. Then again, that's probably not saying much, as the last time I played this game I was too young to care about such things.
From a technical standpoint, I'll admit it took me a little while to get used to Keen's control scheme. It's simple enough, just a little different.
You can play with a keyboard or a joystick, but here we'll be focusing on keyboard controls. You move with the arrow keys, jump with control, and use your pogo stick once you get it with alternate. But it's when you fire your gun that things start getting a little bit iffy with the controls. I'll talk more about that in a bit.
Have to say, Keen felt a little bit heavy when it came to controlling him, and it felt like it took a bit of effort to get Keen to go anywhere. He's got some momentum to him, and it feels like it takes him just a bit to start and stop. Also, in some of the levels in the first episode, which have icy surfaces, it takes him even longer, and on others you can't even change direction unless you jump. Speaking of jumps, when he does so, it's not an instantaneous animation. He actually crouches a bit in preparation. Now this, I imagine, is partly due to the way you fire your weapon in this game.
You see, by default, control and alternate aren't mapped to the functions of jump and pogo. They're listed in the controls as button 1 and button 2. You fire your weapon by pressing both at the same time. Now, sure, you can rebind the keys, but only what's mapped to movement and what the game knows as button 1 and button 2. So no matter what you switch the keys to, there's always going to be that oddity of having to press 2 keys to fire your weapon. And you can't rapid fire by pressing control and holding it down and rapidly pressing alternate. You have to press both keys each time you want to fire your gun, which is both awkward and annoying. A phrase which, interestingly enough, could describe the process by which you pick which game you want to play.
Double-clicking the desktop icon will only bring up episode 1 of the series. If you want to select any of the subsequent episodes, you have to actually right-click the game in your Steam library and select the episode from there. Okay, so maybe it's not the most taxing thing to do, but it just seems like an unnecessary step that could have been easily handled by a launcher.
But now we move on to episodes 4 and 5, known collectively as Goodbye Galaxy, and it's this version of Keen that I remember most. The story didn't seem to me to be as detailed as the original trilogy, but it still got across what you needed to know.
Meanwhile, everything else about the game has been greatly improved. The backgrounds are more detailed, the sounds are now ad-lib. Keen himself not only feels more responsive to control, but can do more things than he could in the original trilogy. Now, that little issue I had with pressing 2 buttons to fire your weapon is still present in these episodes, but thankfully isn't the requirement this time, as you have the option to bind a 3rd key specifically for shooting.
There are even 3 difficulty settings now. I played on normal mode, and I regretted it. You see, no matter the episode, no matter the difficulty, Commander Keen is not for the casual gamer. It will test not just your skill, but your patience. But if you can work past the difficulty, and the sometimes iffy controls, I think you'll find that it is still quite an enjoyable classic, and I had a great time revisiting it after so many years. That'll do it for this first episode of QuickTime Event. I hope you enjoyed it. Make sure to check out my Facebook and Twitter pages and leave a comment there or here if you'd like to see a more detailed review of any of these games, or if you'd like to suggest a game or a theme for a future episode, even if it's another platformer. Just because I did this one on them doesn't mean I won't do another one sometime down the road. In the meantime, I invite you as always to comment, like, share, and subscribe, and thank you so very much for watching. Chikai mare! Sayonara.